Hey, friends, Kenny Ortiz here. In this video, I'm going to answer the question, is birth control a sin? Is it wrong to use birth control? And then in addition to that, I'm going to just talk about the effects of birth control in general and how Christians should think about birth control. I am recording this video primarily for my students in my gender and sexuality class at Bethany Global University in Minnesota. That's a school where I teach at. So the students in that class are required to watch this video, but I know that because this video will be on YouTube, there will be other people who end up watching this. So glad you're here. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment here or find me on Twitter and you shoot me a message. I'd love to connect with you there. All right, let's talk about birth control for a moment. But I think a preamble question is it wrong to have sex if you're not trying to get pregnant? Like, that's a question. And I know that there are people out there that they view sex as a bad thing. And therefore, like, you should only do it, like, if you're trying to get pregnant. Like, sex is like a necessary evil. Like, you need to do it because you got to have kids. But, you really shouldn't try to enjoy it that much. And I don't think that's a super prevalent ideology out there. Or at least a promoted theology, but it does exist in some parts of the world and some people's minds. And I just want to say very clearly, I think the Bible very clearly would say no to that. As we read through the Song of Solomon, it's very clear God created sex and wants people to enjoy sex within the bounds of marriage. God is the one that made Adam and Eve and tells them to join together as one flesh, right? God is the one that's advocating and promoting them to have sex, not just for procreation. Certainly procreation is very important. Having children is a huge part of it, but it's not the only reason why God created sex. That's very clear. God could have created sex not as a pleasurable thing, just as a functional thing you do, right? But God didn't do it that way. And so there must be a reason why God did it that way. So I think it's very clear. No, like sex is for many reasons. It's for spiritual bonding, emotional bonding, intimacy, connectivity. There's all sorts of emotional things that happen in the hearts and minds of a couple when they are engaging in sexual intimacy and relations. And so I think it's really, really important to know that sex itself is a beautiful thing. It's a God honoring thing. So long as it is done appropriately within the bounds that God created it for. Okay. So sex is not just for procreation. It's for many things, and God created it and he wants couples to have sex. In some of the previous videos I've recorded, particularly when we go through 1 Corinthians chapter 7, it's very clear God is endorsing and promoting the idea of a man and his wife coming together and having a vibrant intimacy and vibrant sexual relationship. So that's important. So sex is not just for procreation, right? Otherwise, when a woman hits menopause, when a woman is in her 40s or 50s and hits menopause, that's the time where she can no longer have children. It would then be sinful for her to have sex with her husband after menopause, right? If sex is only for procreation, but it's not only for procreation, right? Or what about couples that can't have children because there's some medical issue they're dealing with? Does that mean they should avoid having sex now that they can't get pregnant? Is it sinful for them to have sex? No, of course not. That's silly. That completely flies in the face of what we see in the scripture. So having sex for reasons other than procreation is perfectly acceptable and is promoted and endorsed by the scriptures. Okay. So you can have sex to have children. Yes, that's a good thing. You should do that when you're married, but you should also have sex for other reasons as well, as we clearly see endorsed and promoted in the scripture. So that's really, really important. So sometimes people say, well, you shouldn't use birth control because if you're having sex without the potential of having children, you're doing it wrong. And again, that's just there's no biblical basis for that ideology. So is it okay to have sex and try to avoid getting pregnant? I think the answer is absolutely yes. Now, a quick caveat. Children are really, really important. God wants families to have children. Children are a blessing from the Lord. And so many couples avoid having children because they look at children as an inconvenience. They go, well, I want to have my career and do what I want to do. And they basically make their personal or material success more important than cultivating a family. And that is contrary to what we would see in the scriptures. The scriptures is really, really focused on men and women coming together and putting a really, really high value, a high premium on having children and raising godly children in a godly fashion. That is really, really important to God. That is way more important to God than your career or any sort of material success. Okay. So if someone is avoiding having children for some selfish reasons, or even reasons that seem neutral or benign, I think you're potentially missing out on something. So I would encourage you to really kind of rethink that in some ways. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some links in the comments of this video here for some sermons and teachings that I've seen from other preachers that I think are really, really helpful to kind of help challenge the way people think. So I'd encourage you, if what I just said to you, you're not sure about, or if it offends you or kind of rubs you the wrong way, I'd encourage you maybe check out some of the links in this comment section that will be helpful to you in the future. Okay, so that's a really, really long preamble. Sex is for procreation, but it's not only for procreation, right? And procreation should be really important. Family raising and family cultivation should be extremely, extremely important to those of us who are Christians. But having sex and trying to avoid pregnancy is also not sinful if you have a really good reason, right? So if you're a newlywed couple and you're kind of broke because you're young, like avoiding having children, early on might be wise until you kind of build up some resources, right? That could be wise. There could be some really good reasons to maybe avoid having children for a season or for a period of time, right? There's definitely value in trying to do that. But generally speaking, generically, kind of broadly speaking, the vast majority of American Christians are trying to avoid pregnancy way too much, way too often, and are putting way too much effort in avoiding having children. That is my opinion, based on my understanding of what I see in our culture, and I would want to push back and challenge that ideology. So is it okay for you to have sex and try to avoid pregnancy? Absolutely. Just make sure you're doing it for really good, God-honoring reasons, not just for mere convenience or selfishness, okay? That's just again, I know there's all sorts of caveats and all sorts of unique situations people find themselves in and all sorts of nuances to this conversation. I'm speaking very, very generically, very, very broadly, okay? So with all that stated, let's talk about birth control specifically. So I've already said, is it wrong to have sex and avoid pregnancy? No, it's not. And so there are ways to avoid getting pregnant if a married couple is having sex on a regular basis. But there are some wise and appropriate ways to avoid getting pregnant. And then there are some really, really unwise and foolish ways to avoid getting pregnant. And that's what I want to talk about in this video primarily. Let me just I know the vast majority of people watching this video, no doubt, already have a good understanding of sexuality, I hope at least. But I am going to cover a little bit just the female anatomy here. I think it'll be helpful. So you see on the screen there's a diagram. Several months ago, I made a joke to my students in class that I was not going to have diagrams in the class, but lo and behold, here we are, the very last week of our course, the very last instructional video. I brought out the diagrams. Okay, so here you go. So as many of you know, women have ovaries. This is where a woman's eggs are stored. Women are born with pretty much all the eggs they'll ever have for their entire life. They're born with them in their ovaries. And then after puberty, a woman will have her first menstrual cycle. And what happens during the menstrual cycle is the ovaries release an egg into the fallopian tube, right? And so I don't know if you guys can see here, right? You see my mouse here. So right out of the fallopian tube, and then it comes down into the uterus right here. And then the egg is here, and if there's no sperm anywhere in the fallopian tube or in the uterus, if there's no sperm here, what begins to happen during this process right here, the uterus lining, right here, it thickens up, mostly blood and some other membranes and mucus like material, but that's pretty much that's on the lining of the uterus. If there's no sperm present, the egg doesn't get fertilized, and then eventually the uterus expels both the egg and the uteral lining that's attached. It builds up there, preparing for a potential pregnancy. When the uterus realizes, hey, there's going to be no pregnancy this month, it expels all of that blood that was in the uteral lining and the materials there, and that's what a woman is menstruating, what we would commonly or crassly refer to as a woman's period. So during those few days during the month, a woman is basically expelling the blood and material that was a part of the uteral lining there. Okay, that's pretty much what happens. Now, if a woman, excuse me. And most women are typically on a 26 to 30-day cycle. 28 days is about average. This process happens every 26 to 30 days, an egg is released. It travels down the fallopian tubes. Okay. It takes about 24 hours to get to this point in the fallopian tube, right kind of before the uterus. And then it comes into the uterus, and then it gets flushed out. And then the process starts all over again. Okay. If, however, a woman does get pregnant, right, if the egg is traveling through the fallopian tubes and the sperm has traveled through the vagina into the uterus and up into the fallopian tube, that's the majority of the time where it's taking place happens. The sperm travels all the way up this area into the fallopian tube. The egg is then fertilized and then travels down into the uterus. And by that point, the uteral lining has been getting thickened, preparing for a potential pregnancy. And then the egg then attaches to the uteral lining right there. Okay, as you see on the screen there, it attaches to the uteral lining and it attaches itself. And instantly what happens is messages get sent from your uterus to your brain telling you a fertilized egg is now attached to the uteral lining. A woman is now pregnant, and instantly your brain begins to change the way it functions. Your brain begins to send messages to other parts of your body to basically tell your body or begin to produce different types of hormones in different ratios than it otherwise would, and all sorts of things begin to happen. So one of the major things that happen is the uteral lining here, and that uterus there, where that gets thicker, and the uterus in general begins to cultivate in an environment where the baby could develop over the next 40 weeks. Also, what happens is the ovaries, they stop releasing eggs so that the ovary knows to not release eggs during this time because you don't need eggs anymore. The woman is pregnant. So then the baby grows in the uterus for 40 weeks or so approximately. And then eventually, obviously, the woman gives birth. So that is, in essence, how a woman's anatomy functions, right? Her reproductive system is functioning. So there are different types of birth control that are utilized to try to block some of these things. So let me explain a few of them. The most popular type of birth control are oral contraceptives. These are basically what people call the pill or birth control pills, right? And there are different types of birth control pills, and they do different types of things. And some of them do a variation of things. So one form of oral contraceptive, and again, there's several different types out there, but one form of oral birth control basically is a pill. It's a combination of synthetic chemicals that basically trick your brain into thinking that you're pregnant if you're a woman. Okay. So basically what it does is that you take this pill orally and, every day for over the course of several weeks, and eventually it tricks your brain into thinking, we're pregnant, because it's putting certain chemicals into your body that are only present when a woman is pregnant, where it's causing your body to do certain things that only happen as a woman is after a woman has conceived the child. So it tricks your brain into thinking, she's pregnant. So what happens is your brain starts sending messages to all parts of your body. It tells your ovaries, stop sending eggs out. She's pregnant. It also tells the uteral lining, right, to begin to thicken up. And basically it causes, it does these various things to basically trick your brain into thinking you don't need to do that which you would ordinarily do because she's already pregnant, even though you're not pregnant, right? And so the idea is that if a woman is having sex while she has birth control, and then sperm is then present in the uterus or tries to travel up into the fallopian tubes, it's obviously less likely to ever, it's not going to reach an egg because there's no ovulation taking place. In addition to that, what sometimes birth control pills do, other types of pills do, in addition, is that sometimes they actually present a particular type of hormone that actually forces a thinning of the uteral lining. So you see the lining, right? That talk about the lining there. There are certain birth control pills that introduce certain chemicals or hormones into the woman's body that actually takes that lining and thins it out, so that if a woman were to still release an egg, and if a sperm would reach an egg and fertilize it, it would then travel from the fallopian tubes down into the uterus, and it would try to attach to the uteral lining, but the uteral lining is so weak that it doesn't allow it to stick, so that the fertilized egg then floats around in the uterus, and eventually the body doesn't realize that the woman's pregnant, that it's actually conceived, fertilized an egg. So again, the uterus comes time for period, it extracts and pushes all that uterine lining out, and along with it comes the fertilized egg out during that woman's period. And in essence, basically what you've created is an unintentional abortion. Like, let me say that again. Birth control pills that intentionally weaken the uterine lining, in essence, they create an accidental abortion, potentially. I don't want to do that. I don't think you want to do that either. We as Christians that stand for life, we believe that life starts at conception. This is unacceptable. And so you don't want to be taking that type of birth control pills. The other problems is that these birth control pills, when they trick your brain into thinking you're pregnant sometimes, they're introducing hormones or chemicals that begin to raise your hormone levels, or they put them in a different ratio that's inappropriate. And so there's been several studies that have proven that it increases your chance of breast cancer down the road, that it increases your chance for blood clots, because the hormone ratios are not quite right. It increases your chance for liver failure or liver problems, or your liver functions, because your liver is having to process things that it otherwise wouldn't have processed. Liver tumors have been tied to excess use of birth control or prolonged use of birth control. These are the types of things that begin to happen. So not only are you potentially having an unintentional or accidental abortion unknowingly, and killing unintentionally killing a fertilized egg, a child in the womb, but now you're also potentially causing health damage to the woman's body down the road. And I know a lot of people will say, well, the chances are so low. It's not a high risk. It's in the single digit percentile. But there's been some recent studies, really from 2005 or 2015 on, and I'll link them in the comments for this video. I'll link them in the description for this video, that show like anywhere from 10 to 30% of women, I'm going to say that again, between 10 to 30% of women will definitely have some adverse effect from birth control. Now, maybe the adverse effect will be minor. Maybe it will maybe cause a little bit of problems for a few weeks or a few months, and you get over it. For most women, any negative damage is very, very small and only is temporary. I understand that, yes. But why even take that risk? Like, why do that? Like, someone's like, oh, the risk of birth control or for breast cancer for a woman on birth control is only increased by 1%. Why would I want to do anything intentionally that increases my wife's chance of breast cancer? It seems, it's just my opinion. It's my opinion. It just seems odd and silly to me that we would intentionally do that. So I don't think that's a wise way to go. Again, just my opinion. I don't have any strong theology there. I'm just understanding the science of how it works and thinking to myself, I don't think I love the way that works. Also, there are two other dangers that birth control sometimes oral contraceptives and hormonal contraceptives can lead to. One is an increase of what's called ectopic pregnancies. If you don't know what this is, basically, as I said earlier, the sperm travels through the uterus up into the fallopian tubes, okay? And it meets the egg there and it fertilizes it, and then the fertilized egg, the baby, travels down to the uterus and attaches to the uterine lining, okay? However, because of some of the birth control pills and the way they work, it basically slows the speed or rate of your ovulation. That's when the egg is being released. So the egg is released in the fallopian tube later than it should in the month, and it basically goes slower, which means sometimes the sperm travels all the way up the fallopian tube and it fertilizes the egg way up here, okay? And what ends up happening is that the egg starts to travel down the fallopian tube, but it has to travel such a long way that sometimes it kind of just slows down right here. Okay. And what sometimes happen is if you have birth control pill that you've taken, if it fails in this case, which it does sometimes, but because you have these hormones, the uterine lining that usually is down here starts to flow into the fallopian tube, and it basically allows the fertilized egg to attach to the lining of the fallopian tube here rather than down in the uterus where it's supposed to. So you end up with a fertilized egg that basically attaches here, and the baby starts to develop and grow here. Well, this is called an ectopic pregnancy. And the chance of survival for a woman with an ectopic pregnancy is pretty much 0%. If a woman gets pregnant and the baby is conceived and then attaches itself to the lining of the fallopian tube, the chance of survival for both the woman and the baby is pretty much close to 0%. This is obviously a devastating type of thing. If you're taking birth control, you're increasing the chance of an ectopic pregnancy. Now, could this happen to any woman regardless? Absolutely it could, but you're increasing the percentage chance. Again, why would you do this? This seems like a terrible idea. Lastly, for women who take birth control that weakens their uterine lining intentionally, what has happened to some women, again, it's not a high percentage, it's less than 10%, but it has happened to some women that after they stop taking birth control for several months, or in some rare cases, even for several years, their brain still thinks, that still doesn't realize it, and still is intentionally producing the hormones that weakens the uterine lining. So it's like you've already trained your body to have a weak uterine wall, uterine lining, and it doesn't know how to strengthen itself. So when a woman stops taking birth control, even for months, or some cases even years later, she wants to get pregnant. She and her husband are they're engaging sexual relations, and they just can't get pregnant because even though the egg is getting fertilized, because the uterine lining is so weak, it doesn't attach. And some women, just because of their genetics and their biology, have weaker uterine lining than others. Some women, it's just weaker than other people. It's just a pure genetic thing. For those women, if they're taking birth control for a long period of time, and if their body is not able to readjust after they stop taking birth control, the chances of a fertilized egg ever attaching to their uterine lining is very, very low. So does this happen to all women? Of course not. Does it happen to most women? No, it doesn't. But there are a segment of the population, there are certain women that if they take birth control for an extended period of time, that when they stop taking birth control, the chances of them getting pregnant is low because of the damage that the birth control has done over the course of several years. So now you've been taking birth control, you don't want to have kids, and now you stop taking it because you want to have kids, and now you can't have kids because of this problem we're having. So as you can see, like the increased chance of ectopic pregnancies, the increased chance of miscarriages or problems with getting pregnant later down the road, the increased chance of an unintentional abortion, the increased chance of blood clots, liver failure or problems, or liver tumors, or breast cancer. These are all reasons to say, I want no part of that. And again, so many people will say, listen, Kenny, you're being, you're fear mongering, you're exaggerating it. Yes, there's our risk, but they're so small, and it's for so few women, and it's so rare, and the negative is so minimal that it's worth the risk. And with all due respect, I just vehemently disagree, and I would implore and exhort every woman watching this: don't buy that stuff from the birth control companies and those who would tout that and promote this. Just I don't think you should believe it. I don't think it's an appropriate ideology for those of us who value life and value health and taking care of our bodies. I don't think this is wise. Again, it's my opinion. It's not theology. I'm not giving you, strong biblical reasonings here. I'm just explaining the science of how it works and saying I don't think this is a wise way to go. Very quickly, a couple other birth control that's popular. A thing called IUDs, intrauterine devices, or intrauterine devices. Excuse me. They're called IUDs. There's two types of IUDs. Basically, IUD is a device that gets implanted in the uterus. Okay, usually it's a small T-shaped device. There's two different types. One is hormonal. I can't talk today. So it's usually either a piece of plastic that has hormones built into it, or it's a device that releases a certain hormone. And it basically functions a lot of the same ways of oral contraceptives. So basically it's birth control, but rather than taking a pill, it's just a device in your uterus. A lot of women like it because they don't have to worry about remembering to take a pill every day. It's just in there, but it has a lot of the same situation, a lot of the same effects, right? So it's a little device sitting inside the uterus that's pumping hormones into the uterus, and it gets absorbed into the blood system, and it has a lot of the same effects that the oral pill does. But in fact, a lot of doctors say that it's more effective than the birth control pill because it pumps more hormones directly in your blood system. So it's more effective for preventing pregnancy, but it's also more effective in creating some of those byproducts that I talked about earlier: breast cancer, liver function problems, liver tumors, ectopic pregnancies, unintentional abortions, things of that nature, right? All those side effects, those negative ramifications, the chance of those things go slightly up with the IUD because it's more effective in doing what it's supposed to do. The other type of IUD is one that's called the metallic IUD or copper IUD. This was not nearly as popular anymore. It used to be much more popular when IUDs first came on the market, but some women still do use it. Basically, it's usually a metallic IUD is a piece of copper or metal that sits in your uterus. It does not pump hormones into your system, but basically what it does, it creates a toxic environment in your uterus. There's a piece of metal, okay, that's sitting in your uterus, and it basically creates this toxic environment. So if the sperm travels into the uterus, it kills it. It can't survive in that for the most part. Or if the egg does get fertilized by a sperm and makes it down into the uterus, this toxic environment basically kills it. Once the fertilized egg touches the copper piece or touches the copper residue that's floating around in your uterus, it kills it instantly. It's like a poison. I don't think I have to explain why this is a terrible idea, right? The idea of having a piece of metal floating around your uterus sounds disgusting to me. I would highly recommend against it. There are doctors that say it's perfectly safe, the risk is really low, but the reality is there's been recent studies that have shown that this is tied to certain forms of cancer. So the popularity of the copper or metallic IUD has significantly gone down over the years. Praise God. There's also another type of IUD or IUD-like hormonal thing, which is a birth control implant. The most popular one is called Nexaplan, I think it's pronounced. Basically, it looks like a little matchstick, and it actually, for most women, they implant it in their arm underneath their muscle there, and it's a little piece of metal or a little piece of plastic material device that releases hormone into the blood system directly. So it has the exact same effect as a hormonal IUD, but rather than being in your uterus, it's in your arm. Apparently, it's more effective and it has less risk. That's what they apparently say. That's what doctors are saying. But I wouldn't surprise me if 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're doing studies and we find out, oh, it's actually, maybe it doesn't have these side effects, but actually has these over here we didn't know about. That's kind of the nature of hormonal treatments of any kind. So I think that's important to consider. So that's the implant. There's also another one called NuvaRing, which is again, it's basically like a little looks like a piece of plastic ring that a woman inserts through her cervix, through her vagina, into the uterus. And basically, it's the same deal. It releases hormones into the uterus, into the area there, and it basically doesn't allow for pregnancy to happen. Again, it does a lot of the same things, and usually it usually lasts for about a month. Women take that in and out. Typically. So those are all the different types of birth control that exist that are really popular. And my opinion, again, this is my opinion, I think all of them are really bad ideas, all of them, because they have major ramifications and negative side effects that I think are really, really not ideal. Now, I will give one quick caveat. I do know that there are women out there that have just medical issues in general that not related to pregnancy. They have all kinds of medical problems, and sometimes doctors will prescribe certain types of birth control because those birth control will introduce hormones that women need for other medical reasons not related to reproduction, or doctors will prescribe a certain birth control because it'll help regulate certain hormones. There are certain oral birth controls that do help to regulate certain hormones. But the reality is that should be that should not be the go-to. That should be the kind of a last resort. And a lot of doctors kind of just go to it quickly. And I would recommend women really think about it, read a lot about whatever's being prescribed to you, pray about it, talk to multiple doctors if you can, and really try to do some research. There may be situations where a woman has to take one of those because there's no other medicine on the market that will solve whatever she's dealing with, some other problem, and she absolutely has to take it because it's the only thing that'll help her. Which in that case, I would say it's fine, but I would just say, just know that there's going to potentially be some side effects that could be really negative down the road. And so you want to just really, really have discernment and really think about that before you jump in. But that's a really, really rare case. Like, most women don't deal with that. Most people take birth control just because they want to have sex and not have to worry about getting pregnant. And a lot of men want their wives and their women to take birth control because they don't want to have to wear condoms, because sex is more pleasurable without a condom. And quite frankly, I want to challenge the men watching this video. Men, if you're going to ask your wife to take oral contraception or do birth control that's potentially going to be negative to her just because you want to have it feel better, I got to tell you, man, I think that's incredibly selfish. I think it's incredibly selfish. You're asking your wife to potentially increase her risk of all kinds of problems down the road just because you want to feel a little bit better. Come on, bro. Really? Dudes, that's stupid. Don't ask your wife to do that. Okay, so what are the ways you could potentially have sex without getting pregnant? Because you said, I know you're probably thinking, Kenny, you said it's not sinful for us to have sex trying to avoid pregnancy. Yes, there are some appropriate forms of birth control that I would like to introduce you to. You already know this. Number one, it's condoms. They are the most effective birth control for avoiding pregnancy and the most effective for stopping STDs. Generally, condoms, latex condoms are the most effective. Polyurethane condoms are very effective if a woman is allergic to latex, which does happen. And so then you need when you use polyurethane, they're a little more expensive. Typically, but if a woman is allergic to latex, obviously she can't have sex with a man who is using a latex condom. There are animal skin condoms made from animal skin. Those are obviously not nearly as effective because animal skin is porous, just like human skin is. So sperm cells could sneak through there. But those have a very unique feeling that people want. It does decrease the chance of pregnancy, but they're not nearly as effective. So latex condoms and polyurethane condoms are really at the top of the list. I just want to challenge men. Like the reality is, like using a condom in sex maybe doesn't seem sexy. It doesn't seem, it seems messy. There's problems with it. Yes, there's downfalls, but the feeling of sex with a condom versus without a condom is very, very minimal indifference is what the majority of guys will say. Any guy who just insists on not using a condom is just, I think potentially being selfish in some ways. So just be careful. Okay. The other potential way to avoid pregnancy is kind of what we would be known as natural family planning. And in this case, you don't have to use a condom because you have to know what are the chances of a woman getting pregnant. So let me go back to my trusty diagram here. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, a woman ovulates. Her egg leaves the fallopian tube, comes down here, and it travels down into the uterus. Okay. This happens once per month or once every 26 to 30 days, depending on who the woman is. But approximately once a month, one egg comes out of the fallopian tube, right? And then it travels down to the uterus. And within 24 hours, it then starts to get expelled, right? It's only within a day or two or less, 12 to 24 hours in most cases, your uterus starts the process of flushing that out. Once the uterus sees that the egg is not fertilized, it starts the process of getting rid of it. Okay. And so in some cases, even if a woman were to get pregnant after that process has started, it's possible that the egg was fertilized but ends up getting pushed out. And so it's kind of it's what we would call that a miscarriage. And a lot of times women don't even realize they were pregnant, don't even know they were pregnant, and they have a miscarriage because they get pregnant so late in the menstruation cycle that their uterus ends up forcing it out. It doesn't even realize that it was fertilized. So there's only a 24-hour period in the entire month where a woman can get pregnant, which, if you think about it, that is unbelievable, right? Like it's remarkable that there's billions of people on the planet because it's so hard for a woman to actually get pregnant. Sperm cells can live. Most sperm cells will die within a few hours, but there are some sperm cells that can live anywhere from 3 to 6 days. 5 days is about the average. Some sense people will say, but about 3 to 5 days, there will be some of the sperm that survives a significant amount of time, kind of hanging out in the uterus. So if a woman ovulates here and it doesn't get and it doesn't get fertilized in the fallopian tube, the sperm doesn't make it up the fallopian tube, it's possible for her to conceive in the uterus, right? And it's only during this 24-hour period that it can happen. So if a couple's trying to get pregnant, what most fertility doctors will recommend is that the couple will have sexual relations multiple times for the 5 or 6 days leading up to it, so that there's a significant amount of semen and sperm present in the uterus, and it gives it a better chance to kind of make its way up to the fallopian tube. But pretty much, if there's no eggs present, if there's no woman's not ovulating and there's no eggs present, the chance of her getting pregnant is 0%, right? You can't fertilize something that's not there. And once the process of extracting the uteral lining and getting rid of the egg starts, it's unlikely she gets pregnant. So it's actually really, really hard for a woman to get pregnant. And so what a lot of married couples do is just figure out, okay, when is the ovulation period? If the woman is going to ovulate on this day, the 14th of the month, basically you just say, hey, for the week before and maybe a few days after, for about a 10-day period, we're just going to go ahead and use condoms during that 10-day period, pretty much. And then pretty much any time after that, you can pretty much have sex with, like, the chance of getting pregnant is virtually 0%. It is possible that, a woman could ovulate more than once in a cycle. It's extremely rare, but it does happen. Maybe a woman will release an egg and then get just kind of a weird freak accident a week later, another one. I mean, it does happen. Again, it's just extremely rare. Those types of things could take place. Or sometimes, eggs maybe take longer through the fallopian tube to get through, so people don't realize it. Or sometimes, if a woman is having sex right before or right after her menstruation is happening, there could be sperm that gets it ends up being present there, and maybe it just ends up surviving in the uterus for an extended period of time longer than expected. So there are these kind of weird things that happen during sex, or, during sexual relations and production and reproduction that causes the chance of pregnancy to go up. But the reality is, what most married couples that don't want to use any kind of, of the birth control that's going to cause problems, what they typically do is say, okay, here's when a woman is ovulating, 5 to 6 days before and a few days after. You just kind of pick a 10 to 12 day window in the middle of the cycle there, where you just say, we're going to use condoms during this time. And then the rest of the time we're going to have sex with no problem. And the chances of us getting pregnant is virtually zero, right? Unless the sperm cells happen to survive for an abnormal amount of time. And if something like that happens, it's just kind of a freak, weird thing, I just get chalking up to say, that's God's sovereignty. God wanted us to get pregnant then. Like God's providence. Like if it happens, it happens. It's so rare. It's such a small percentage chance of happening that if it does happen, I just got to say, that's what God wanted and we love it. Praise the Lord. So I think that's the approach. So if married couples want to avoid getting pregnant, I think that's perfectly appropriate. And the way to do that, again, is just know, their cycle. Every woman kind of knows her cycle. I would encourage every woman to kind of do a little bit of reading online. Just understand ovulation to the best of your ability. Understand what it is. Make sure your husband understands it. Just guys understand, on the same page and know. There are lots of websites out there that talk about natural family planning, basically what days of the month. I mean, there are websites that go even more to the extreme of like, they take the woman's temperature, because they're a woman's body temperature, pretty much if it's higher than normal or lower than normal, like the chances of the chances of the sperm surviving, or the chances of her getting pregnant. Like there's all these ramifications that a woman can't get pregnant or can't conceive under certain ramifications. So there's websites out there that will teach you, like, a woman should take her temperature in the morning and know she's more likely to be fertile or less likely. And my opinion, that just feels like it's too much and feels like it's way over the top and kind of feels like a weird thing. But if you like that, go for it. If your family did that and they think it's great, I would highly encourage you, go ahead and go for it. To me, it feels like a little bit overkill. But I'm not a married man, so maybe if I have 9 kids one day, you'll be saying, Kenny, you should have had your wife take her temperature. Anyway, all that to say, there are a lot of resources on the web out there, a lot of good blogs from reputable doctors and books that talk a lot about menstruation and ovulation. I think it's valuable for both men and women to have a thorough understanding of how that works, and really develop your really cultivating your sex life and your sexual relations in such a way that will kind of line up with what your reproduction goals are. That's at least that's the hope. Okay, so that's it. I'm looking through my notes, make sure there's nothing else that I need to cover. I think that's everything. I need to cover. I know this kind of sounds like a weird lecture to give, but I wanted to just kind of cover it from a more ethical perspective, not just theological or medical, but I wanted to give a little bit of the kind of the ethical and philosophical thoughts behind what I think is ideal. I wanted to challenge the men to both understand their wife's body, as well as not making unrealistic or unfair expectations of your wife in marriage. As always, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to reach out to me. If you're one of my students at BGU, feel free to email me, text me, whatever. I'd love to correspond with you. If you're someone who's not one of my students, you just stumbled across this link on YouTube, feel free to find me on Twitter, reach out to me. I'd love to connect with you. And also check out the links in the comments below for further resourcing. Love you guys. Again, if you need anything, reach out to me. Have a great day.